Screenagers, welcome back into another episode of the Canon, the only movie podcast providing you with the most essential movie watch list. Today we've got another great episode for you. We're going to be talking about John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982. I'm joined by a very special guest, someone who I've enjoyed talking about movies with for the last couple of years. You know, ever since we met, we really just hit it off. And he has a bunch of interesting things to say about movies. He works in the industry. Screenagers, welcome to the show, my good friend, screenwriter, scriptwriter, Connor McKnight. Connor, how are you? What's going on?
Very good. To be talking about The Thing, nothing better.
So before we get into The Thing itself, like I mentioned, you are a writer. Obviously, the big news in the world of screenwriting is the strike, the Writers Guild strike that just ended. I'm curious about how you experienced all of that, how you are experiencing the agreements that were made and all of that stuff. So I feel like I kind of want to pick your brain a little bit about your thoughts on all of that stuff before we actually get into The Thing, if that's cool. So if you could just maybe give us a little bit of background about, your lifetime as a writer, sort of what that means, bring us into your world a little bit. And then from there, sort of talk us through how you experienced the strike and what things are looking like, within your industry coming out the other end of this.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely a tumultuous period. I think a lot of, Hollywood changes a lot in terms of streaming, in terms of what genres work theatrically, and so on and so forth. And I feel like a lot of these sort of labor disputes we end up having are related to shifts in the industry. And so this sort of felt like a reaction to some shifts that were happening, especially in the TV space. And so the kind of, it was an unfortunate period just in terms of conflict and maybe not having a speedy resolution that would bring everyone back to work. But yeah, the great kind of silver lining is it is kind of resolved, and we get to do the thing that we, moved to LA to do, which is very nice. Especially because it is a passion that drives you to pick a career path like that, and it comes with the territory of freelance, and it's tough, and sometimes bigger industry things make it a little bit tougher. But it's very nice to be on the other side of it, and get back to what we love.
Sweet. Well, I'm happy that you're getting back to actually writing. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about The Thing specifically, one, I know that it's one of your favorite movies, but your sort of wheelhouse for writing and just film fandom is the horror genre. So I know you write a lot within that space, which is obviously, again, why we're bringing you in to talk about this movie. What is it about this genre specifically that sort of speaks to you?
Yeah, there's a lot of, it's a good question, and there's a lot of elements to it. One, personally, it's a favorite genre to watch first and foremost. I think that's for a lot of creatives, it comes down to, at the end of the day, what is your sort of favorite thing to consume, and that ends up being what you create. That's what inspires you. You watch something like The Thing and want to write a creature feature, that's kind of comes with the territory. But there's a couple reasons why I like horror. One, I think there is a fascinating magic trick that's pulled, that a two-dimensional image that can't fundamentally hurt us can scare us. That you get so sucked into a story that the threats and the stakes the characters encounter, the monsters and everything, feel real enough in that moment that a movie can make you jump, that it can make you sweat. That's a really, I think, cool audience to movie interaction that I don't think you get in other genres. Yes, an action movie can be very thrilling. Yes, a comedy can be very funny, but there is a very interesting relationship between an audience member sitting there in a dark room surrounded by other people that you even forget that they're there, and experience something that causes some sort of primal reaction. And what's always been cool for me is there are people that love that, and there are people that hate that. There's no middle ground. You're either all in or you really don't like how that movie makes you feel. And actually, it's you started with this conversation about the strike, and we asked the question of genres that have really survived, especially as theatrical movie-going experiences. And I don't think it's a coincidence that horror specifically lasts. That for a lot of us going to that theater on a Friday night, a packed crowd of other people who like this stuff, like that is kind of ritualistic. It is, you don't get that
Yeah.
experience. You can scare yourself sitting there watching at home, but with other people, it's an interesting collective sort of genre.
Yeah,
Uh,
for sure. There's a lot of like there's a weird interaction that's happening between audience and creative that you really don't get. There's like a participation from the audience. So when you're writing horror specific, movies, are you are you thinking about that audience interaction and that audience sort of like back and forth that's happening? Is that something that you're actively thinking about?
all the time but it's more of when you're writing it, you're putting yourself in the shoes as a fan. And I think that's kind of, and again, it's why I think a lot of other horror create, like, we all kind of have a lot of fun doing what we do, because it's, when I'm sitting there and I'm writing something, it's like, okay, not only what scares me, but I'm like, okay, I'm in the scene, there's the loud noise that happens over there, I know I'll jump during that. Like, you really are orchestrating that sort of thrill ride experience. And I
Hmm.
think that's a lot of fun in the creative process. And when we get into the thing, like, the thing does a lot of really cool things about the information it gives the audience, what it shows the audience and what it doesn't show the audience, and how that builds the paranoia and the suspense. And it's kind of it's a fun to be under the hood of that, and to be creatively putting those narrative events in a certain order to scare someone or create that reaction. I think is, I don't know, that's what we live for. It's like very much. So yes, long story short, you are thinking about the audience reaction, because you're thinking
Hmm.
about when you're going to scare them. You're thinking about the tension you're building in this sequence. You're thinking about the information you give them, that when something scary happens, they have a little bit of information to understand it, but not enough to be not afraid of it. And it is that sort of, it's a it's a very fun narrative balancing act to create stories like that, or that's as an art piece too. I think that's a lot of fun.
That's rad. That's I am someone who does actually live in that weird sort of middle ground between I'm not all in on the genre, but I don't hate it. Like, I definitely appreciate what it's doing, and there are a ton of horror movies that I love, including this one. But there are also so many that I will stay away from for my remaining years on this earth. But that's okay. Um, so I think all this background is super helpful for us sort of understanding like where you're coming from when it comes to the thing, and like your background as a creative, and someone who's telling stories sort of similar to the thing, and why that makes you an expert in terms of why you're here with us to talk about this particular movie. So I think with all that being said, there's going to be plenty of stuff for us to talk about with regards to the thing. So let's get into it. Let's talk about the movie itself. Like I said, John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982. It's, I don't know, what is it, a follow up to Big Trouble in Little China?
No, it's before it. It's right after Escape from New York.
Okay, so he does Halloween, then Escape from New York, which is also with Kurt Russell, and then we get to The Thing. So I don't know if you have any sort of like general background info about how The Thing sort of came to be, how John Carpenter came to be attached to it, to be the director for it, or anything like that. But if you do have any of that background, I feel like it would be helpful before we get into movie itself.
Not too much. He did it was Halloween. He has the fog there too, which is another kind of cool one he did, and then Escape from New York. Most of what I know about the actual production of the thing is more of the reception and how it was super poorly received. So he ended up doing Christine
Hmm.
next. But that this is a movie that, again, and horror I think is a very cool genre for this, that withstood the test of time, that people started discovering it later and realizing, look, Carpenter has a great filmography of a lot of bangers, of really, really strong movies.
Yeah.
And it's cool that this one found its time in the sun retroactively of this. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like it was, when it originally came out, it was sort of, critics didn't like it. The audience wasn't totally responding to it, but then over time, it totally found its audience and is now considered a classic, an essential. It's in the canon, obviously. So you're one of those audience members that sort of found it later on down the road. Walk me through like your first time seeing this movie, how you responded to it then. Was it something you fell in love with immediately, or not so much? And like, what's your overall relationship to this movie?
Yeah. So I was either 15 or 16. I was in high school and I was watching a lot of horror. I'd obviously watched Halloween. I had watched, my dad loves Big Trouble in Little China. So I'd watched that young. I very well aware of Carpenter. And yeah, I was going through sort of his list. I think I watched The Fog maybe before that and saw this movie. So I grew up, I really love Alien. Alien is like one of the like quintessential, I call it the Holy Trinity, the Halloween, Alien, and The Thing. Those are like
Love it.
in the pantheon of like horror movies that are above and beyond most other things that exist.
If we're talking about Connor's personal canon, it's like those three movies and then everything else.
Yeah. There's some modern ones that I can consider in that arena, but those three are like, I have seen all three of those too many times to count. I watch Halloween every week of Halloween every year.
I love that.
It's just like, to me, it's just like perfect. But this one's not far off either, for a lot of different reasons. But when I watched it, it was the twofold. Because I'd seen Jaws, and I feel like this does some similar things with Jaws of introducing. So that's what I was immediately struck, is that before we get to the glorious creatures and the practical effects and everything crazy that actually happens, there's some great fear of the unknown plotting of introducing ideas of, we don't know why the Norwegians are shooting at the dog, but there's something weird going on. You go to their camp or their version of a research center and you see the aftermath. You see the strange body. You see the fucking... am I allowed to swear on this thing?
That's fine.
We can edit it out. You see the ice block and what was in there is now gone. You see the excavation site. So that was the first thing that struck me, of it really built this idea that there was something horrible out there. And then when you see how horrible and how visceral it actually is, it's just a really, there's nothing else like it. And then there's the paranoia. It has everything. It has there's a little bit of an Agatha Christie in it, of who in this camp could possibly be. You have a great 80s character, McGreedy, that is, Kurt Russell at his finest. It's one of the best character intros of all time, of him playing chess and loses playing the computer, dumps his whiskey inside of it, short circuits it, and says, "cheating bitch." And that is his first line in the movie. Or I think it's his second, but it's still just like a great way to into his character. And then he steps outside and you realize it's daylight and he's drinking. So it's like, these are just great little beats. But yeah, in terms of, look, it's almost even unfair to call this a B movie, because I think it's so much better than that too, even though I love B movies. But it is just, to me, we just don't get monster movies that creative, that over the top, that surprising, well structured, great location. I don't think it's a coincidence anytime anything's ever set in Antarctica, The Thing is in the background of it. Of like, they're playing with that, because I think this movie, for a lot of people that play in the genre space, is one of the iconic ones. And that is, yeah. So anyway, when I watched it, I was like, all right, this is one of the best. And yeah. And then I've seen it way too many times since then, and I got to watch it again literally last night for this. So great.
So you were immediately in. You were immediately just sold.
Yeah, and I think maybe the caveat is also, the time period that I was watching it too, of revisiting, I grew up with a lot of these horror movies, but starting to watch a lot more of them in a moment where, high school, late 2000s, it was post that really mean horror of after 9/11. We got Hostel, we got Saw. Horror was this very, very real,
Yeah.
visceral thing. The slasher reboots that we got from the 80s are very hard, extremely well made, and pretty good movies. But
Hmm.
horror was super duper mean. And then here is this movie that has nihilism in it. It is existential, but it's
Hmm.
just a great time creature feature that is so unapologetically creative and unlike it. It's awesome.
That's such a
Does that
great
answer
call.
any question? Yeah.
No, that's an amazing answer, and I really love what you brought up about when you were watching this for the first time and sort of what was going on in like your world around you as a movie watcher, because I think that does play into how you respond to it the first time, and I think honestly, like when you're watching a movie for the first time, that is going to then inform how you understand it for the rest of your viewings after that. And obviously we weren't alive in 82 to see this in theaters where we're both young strapping men. So we weren't around in 82 to catch it in theaters. So like we don't have that context of like what was going on then, but you do have the context of the first time that you watched it, which I feel like is super important to how you understand the movie. I think otherwise, within that answer, you brought up a lot of really interesting stuff, a lot of really cool jumping off points where we can, take the conversation next. So, but I think what I do want to ask you next, to just sort of like set the stage for the rest of the conversation, is obviously with your background as a screenwriter, you're approaching movies from a different sort of viewpoint than most audience members. Like
Mhm.
your insight, and because of the work that you do and the world that you live in your day to day, that allows you to watch movies in ways that the rest of us cannot. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how this movie just works on like a script level. I think you did mention some of the stuff like Mac's introduction as a character and how great it is, but I kind of want your overall thoughts on how this movie is working script wise, because I don't think it's necessarily the first thing that people think about when they think about like why is the thing great, but I feel like you can explain it in a way that maybe others can't.
Well, yeah, because I also think it should be remembered for some of those great horror, fear of the unknown things they're doing. It's interesting to also, I think, the older you get, especially if you've seen these movies a couple times, like watching it last night again, you approach it from a different perspective. I think more now versus when I was watching it in high school. You're right. You're more analytical about these movies. What is it doing with each of these subsequent beats? And I
Mm-hmm.
think one of the thing's greatest achievements of a movie, and by God, there's a ton of them, is that opening act. We have that little teaser of, okay, there's a ship, it crashes, we have no time stamp, we don't know when, and we eventually learn, I think it's like 100,000 years ago, whatever.
Yeah.
But the movie opens with men trying to kill a dog from a helicopter, which is
Yeah.
crazy. They're shooting an assault rifle at it. We don't know why. If you had never seen the thing, you didn't know, you're going in, that's a tragedy of movies these days, that we know what we're getting, but
Mm-hmm.
pretend for a second that you live in 82, a friend tells you, hey, we're going to go see this movie thing. You know nothing about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You start this movie, these foreign guys in a helicopter are shooting at a dog running for its life. You know nothing about that. You don't know why they're trying to shoot a dog, which is crazy. It's a crazy thing to do. It's a cinema sin to kill a dog in a movie, but here these guys are shooting an assault rifle out of a helicopter at it. But it immediately starts this narrative question in the audience's mind, and that's
Yeah.
all that first act until you actually see the thing creature for the first time in the dog pen is planting those seeds of why are they doing this? Okay, they're shooting at the dog. The dog seems cute. He's willing to shoot men to kill the dog. Therefore, the dog has to be something bad. It is. I'm not a playwright at all, farthest thing from it. But like it's like Chekhov's smoking gun. It's like you have put there's a bomb inside the U.S. base, and we don't know what it could possibly be, and it's just sitting there. It's building, and that's okay. The Norwegians are acting crazy. We introduced McGreedy, and now we're going over to the Norwegian base, and we see this horrific aftermath. That's another question in the audience's mind of, what could possibly have caused all this, and they show us all these indications that something horrible is afoot, and we make that assumption, but we don't know definitively until we actually see it for the first time, that is really strong horror writing. That is leading the audience to this idea that there is horror in the midst of all these characters and all these men we're meeting for the first time, but they don't know it yet. And so like the audience is ahead enough of the characters, but not ahead enough to be able to guess where it goes. And just where it goes is so surprising that's just the strength of what they accomplished here. Because I really do just, by and large, I think it's a very strong piece of horror writing.
Yeah. Like you said, that opening act is absolutely insane. And I love what you're saying about the audience is ahead of the characters enough to sort of know that something is strange, but it's not like full on dramatic irony where we know something that the characters don't know. And, we don't really know that the dog is the thing. Side note about that opening. So I watched this with Dorothy, who very well, and she got through about 20 minutes of the movie, so she saw that opening scene, and anytime she sees a dog in a movie, she jumps up and goes, "Oh, what a good boy." And no matter what the dog is doing, the dog could be the most evil dog, like ripping people apart, and she's like, "Oh, it's a good dog. It's a good doggy. We love that dog." So her first question was, why are those guys shooting at the dog? And I wanted to say, because that dog is a fucking evil, crazy alien thing that is going to infect the entire base. The Norwegians knew. So yeah, it was cool to like watch it with someone who was experiencing it for the first time and asking those questions that you were talking about, in terms of like how the movie opens up. Are there any other examples of like great writing that you see sort of beyond that first act, or is most of it just like right there?
No. But and once you get into the meat and potatoes of the second act of, first of all, there's some hilarious dialogue about, getting flamethrowers and stuff. But like in terms of the actual structure of the story, it's like the paranoia that is threaded in that middle portion is so, it's right out of Agatha Christie, but we're in a monster movie. It's not someone around us is a murderer, like you get in a Clue thing. It's like, there's a dead body, which one of us could have done it, and we're going to do the whodunit thing. No, the whodunit here is one of us is not just an imposter. We're an absolutely disgusting extraterrestrial creature, and these are and we don't know who it is, and we don't know. So there's a combination of that and them trying to figure out what on earth, what the fuck is going on. And the indications they have to figure that out are like, hey, we put a dog in a dog pen and it turned into the most disgusting thing imaginable that we don't even have words to describe. That paired with the corpse that looks like farthest thing from human. The organs it's just like the autopsies, all these context clues that they're giving us suggest something unfathomable. And the realization that one of the other men or multiple of the other men in this base could be that very same thing drives so much paranoia between those characters throughout the entirety of the second act that it's just, it's just a really, it's funny he's making that in the 80s. Nowadays, everyone talks about the contained thriller, right? Can you do a thriller, a horror movie in one location to keep the price down and that sort of stuff? What we have is a pressure cooker contained thriller with the craziest elements imaginable, the most creative elements imaginable, and any single character can be not who they appear to be. And that's just enough to really drive a great horror movie. Yeah. I love the testing
Paranoia is
too.
the paranoia is absolutely great. I love the connection that you're making to like an Agatha Christie, Booker story, because it really does have that whodunit sort of vibe, but with this creature feature sort of twist that really makes no sense. It's a chamber piece, so it's obviously super claustrophobic. I think the setting of Antarctica is amazing because it forces these characters to be isolated in a way that they otherwise wouldn't be. And it's really like the only way to tell the story. Like the story would not work in any other location where these guys would be like remotely close to some other sort of form of civilization. And the paranoia that just like continues to grow and drive the tension is absolutely brilliant. Do you think that any of the characters at any point are paranoid that they themselves could be the thing? And it's not just the paranoia of that guy could be the thing, but also, I don't know if it's infected me. I might be taking too much of a leap with that. So I was wondering if you got that at all.
No, I don't think you're taking a leap at all. That's why I'm like, I love the testing scene. Because it's one of the interesting. There's two folds of things in what you said that I want to unpack. One, what's interesting about McGreedy as a character is he is so self-assured that he is not the thing, and that's different than some of the other characters. I feel like in that testing scene, I think it's Windows, the guy that was the radio, with the little hippie. The look on his face when they're about to test him, it's a little bit existential. It's like there could be a moment, the realization that I actually am the monster. And I think that's maybe I'm overreading into it, but I think that sort of just, again, it's just a small sliver of a question in the back of a character's head of, if I was this thing, would I be sentient enough to know that? Or is this beyond that? Because they don't understand these creatures. And that's one of the best narrative friends of this movie is because we're happening in real time and all this crazy shit is going on all around them, that there's just, because they can never firmly understand it, there's just the doubts for everything. That's the paranoia. That's anyone around them could be it. I could be it. An animal could be it. Like, as far as they're concerned, an inanimate object could be it. But that's also to the isolation of it all. First of all, they drop the word cabin fever in the line somewhere in the movie, I think early on in the first act. It to me feels like the ultimate Shining reference. But like that's kind of what it is like this character is isolated, can come to crazy self-assessments. I also think there's a great line. There are a couple really good setup lines for that isolation is post everything with the Norwegians and the helicopter and the guns and the dogs. I feel like it's McGreedy, but it might be someone else. Says, "Are we at war with Norway?" Because they wouldn't know unless they were. And that's a great way to say, okay, that's putting you as a writer. You're putting them in the frame of mind of these characters because they are isolated from the world. Windows not being able to get anyone on the radio because they haven't been able to get them in two weeks. That's like the ultimate horror movie hack of getting rid of the they can call for help solution. So now they're trapped with the problem themselves. But in this location, it feels totally natural. And it feels equally natural that his boss is on his ass about finding a way to connect with someone, even though that's never going to happen. But yeah, I like that existential thing you're talking about, this idea that because they don't fully understand this thing, if I was that thing, would I know that? Or did it just happen without my knowledge? Because that's a scary thought.
I think that's a way scarier thought than, this dude next to me might be the thing. Just knowing, like, am I a monster? Yeah. Would I know if I were said monster? But yeah, so I also think that the isolation piece is super interesting, and I feel like the movie does a lot of interesting, like, camera work, which is obviously, I think that's a tool that gets really overlooked when we think about, like, I guess what you in TV would call a bottle episode or a chamber piece or some, in movies where you have these people and they're stuck in a small environment and you're like, well, good cinematography means like when something is big and the camera moves around a lot and there are pretty colors, But good cinematography could also just mean using the environment that you're shooting in to like help tell your story. And if you're using a lot of close-up shots in a movie that's about, the paranoia of claustrophobia, then that's also good cinematography. I don't know if you've mentioned it yet on this episode, but you are the son of a DP. So cinematography is also something that's sort of, in your blood. Is there anything within the way that this movie is shot that like sticks out to you in any sort of particular ways?
There's a twofold in that question. One, first of all, I love the guy the chef rollerblading, and that helps us build out the location. It is very awesome. It feels very much. Again, I'm going to say Shining twice. It feels very much like Danny on his little tricycle riding through. But what's interesting, putting those two side by side, is in The Shining, Kubrick is using that Danny as a means to illustrate how expansive the Overlook is. Whereas here, Carpenter is using that to tell us how contained it is. And I think there is an art, especially in these chamber pieces, and this is director too, both DP and director working together, is how can we take a contained space and over the course of a usually thriller horror narrative, make it feel smaller and smaller and smaller over the course of the story. Because that's, the thrill of the thing is this idea that you're trapped inside with something you don't understand. And how do they convey that, and how they shoot it, and how they make that space itself not only feel like a character. Everyone always says that, and it's more than that. It's how does the space feel like a noose? And how can you make that space feel tighter and tighter and tighter over the course of a nightmare? And look, I think a lot of this is, again, an underappreciated element of the thing is crowding those hallways and those rooms with so much clutter. It makes them feel smaller, which is the point of the story of that. If it felt like wide open, empty spaces when you're doing an autopsy, or when they're putting those bodies where McGreedy has to get his gear out because they don't have enough room, that room feels claustrophobic, even though there's an alternate version of that story where you take all those items out and it feels expansive.
Yeah.
Which is
you have the bodies like sitting on the pool table right next to them. Yeah.
One of my favorite, and this is just about how do you make the audience feel that things are constricting. It's when they're doing that test and they tie all three of those guys together, they're putting them, and these are like, they're strapping men, they're hardened men, they're living out there in the end. And when they all feel small, even Childs, who's, as humongous, are like, when they all feel small, we feel tighter. And it's just, and that's, again, these are all the elements that are working so well in this movie to make us feel a certain way.
Using every tool in your toolbox to tell the story and convey the emotions that you want to convey as a filmmaker. So you mentioned Childs, and we talked a little bit about Mac. And I think you mentioned this before, that one of the great things about this movie is there's some really cheeky character development that's done. And there's not a lot of time or space really for a lot of these characters to breathe, but they do all seem super fully realized. Obviously, McCready, Kurt Russell, he gets the most amount of screen time. And then Childs, Keith David, who's just always amazing. Like, that dude should be in every movie.
Agree.
But he's also great. So I was wondering if you could give us a little bit more about just how you feel about the character development and maybe those two characters specifically, or if there are any, side characters that really stick out to you.
Well, it's funny because actually one of the things the movie got ribbed for, I went back and looked at some of these old reviews because I'm like, you guys are crazy. This movie is awesome. And
I read Ebert's review. Ebert hated it.
Yeah, Ebert hated it. But one of the things it gets ripped for is some of the character development. And I'm going to push back hard on that because I feel like you were saying, you get very limited time with these characters. And you have to find small ways to make them distinct, make them stand out. And I feel like there's enough eccentric elements for a couple of them to immediately Windows, the guy with the jean jacket, and he's at the radio the whole time, and the curly hair immediately stands out.
Yeah.
I love the chef on the roller skates. The fact that he roller skates in this isolated location tells me everything I need to know about this guy. On top of the fact that he's playing Jimi Hendrix, I think, late, and they tell him to turn it down, and he doesn't. Like, that's not only just cool and a great scene, but like that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting there for him as a person.
Mm-hmm.
Or the hippie looking guy who's smoking weed later, and he's progressively says like, "Oh, the government knows all about aliens. They're falling out of the sky," and it's just like those little details really go a long way, I think, in a movie like this. And Aliens does that great too. That's another example of coming. But it's like these movies that have such slim narrative real estate to make you like, and more importantly, remember distinct characters. When they do it in those great, I think it's an art, and I think people don't give it enough credit sometimes, as is the case here.
Oh yeah, the characters are memorable. You might, while you're watching it, think there's not a lot of character development, but you walk away from this movie, you remember the roller skating chef, you remember the guy with the sunglasses at the radio, you remember you remember Gary, who's the supposed lead who has the gun. You remember the scientist. You remember all of these guys because of how distinct they are from each other. That it really, that character development is sort of being done on like a subconscious level, where you're not like actively like, oh, here's a full scene that fleshes out like, who this character is and what their background is. Like, nope, it's a line here, it's a line there, and we move on. But you get it, even though you don't know that you get it. Yeah. I think the other interesting thing with the cast and the characters here is that there are no women in the movie, which I've seen that it's been read as a few different ways about masculinity, like masculine sexuality, things like that. But I feel like it is a very purposeful touch. And, I myself am not reading into it on any sort of deeper level, but I do think that it is a really interesting touch for this movie. And I think that it totally makes sense for what this particular film is.
Yeah, but that goes into the paranoia thing. Because I think what's interesting, and we'll maybe get into the prequel at a certain point, because it does have two women in the cast. But for this movie in particular, what's interesting to me, especially with McCready, who's, and Childs, they're both drawn as these hyper masculine figures. But when these type of men are put in a scenario of peak paranoia with a fatal sort of creature, they turn on the means that they turn on each other is violence. And I think that's fairly interesting. Because that allows, this, especially as a claustrophobic pressure cooker chamber piece, the tension's bubbling up. And for these types of characters, when that tension bubbles up, they do react violently. And that becomes sort of, it's not, and that's why I think the prequel has some really cool elements, because it's more scientists versus these feel like a lot of them are alpha men that don't really, they're responding like peak masculine nature rather than thinking analytically. And that's kind of what makes everything bubble up here. There's a totally interesting movie about the analytical response to this that isn't what the thing's about, because they don't act rationally at all.
But it is interesting because McCready's first scene, the first thing we see him doing is playing chess. So you think this guy is a thinker. He's a critical thinker. He likes to plan things out. He's smart enough. He's heady enough to sort of take on whatever's coming his way. But like you said, they are the immediate response is one of defense, of being defensive and ready to fight. You grab your flamethrower, and whenever you see the thing, you blast it away with fire. You grab a knife because you think McCready's the thing, or you grab your gun and you shoot the guy with the knife because you want to be defensive about whether or not you're the thing, or you threaten to blow up the entire base with dynamite because people are thinking that you're the thing. So yeah, sorry to cut you off, but
no, but it's quite eloquently put, because McCready's intro scene is the best version of that. You introduce him playing chess against a computer, so you think, okay, this guy's He might look rough around the edges, but he's an analytical thinker. That computer beats him. And how does he respond? He takes his, I don't know if it's Jim Beam or whatever, and pours it into the computer and destroys it and says cheating bitch. So it's like two elements there of he might be an analytical thinker, but he's also the guy. I mean, that is, look, in this 80s action thing, he is that guy. So it's a very interesting, and that's why that first scene, in terms of a character intro, is excellent. There might be a subtext there that's interesting of the only female voice then is the computer that he kills immediately. I don't know what the reading there is, but it's just an interesting food for thought for this gender conversation.
The one actual thinker, is destroyed immediately, is a woman, and is no longer available to help them throughout the rest of the movie.
Which might have been totally helpful. Yeah.
One super quick side note, Kurt Russell is an absolute babe in this. Like, I don't know if anyone's ever been hotter in a movie. He's great. So we've talked about this movie for a while. We've talked about a lot of really cool different themes, different aspects of it, but we've failed to mention the big selling point for The Thing. When anyone is asking you, hey, why should I watch The Thing? I feel like the one big answer is the practical effects will knock you on your ass. So we're 40 minutes into this conversation. We haven't mentioned the practical effects. Connor, please we're going to go ISO mode, James Harden ball. I'm going to pass it to you and clear out. Tell us why these practical effects are so amazing.
Well, it's a twofold. One, because they're so unfathomably different than anything you've ever seen before. I think for starters, let's contextualize this of what other movies have come. This is post-Alien, and Alien says, hey, E.T.'s cute, Close Encounters, the idea of the Martian's cute, I'm going to give you the H.R. Geiger most disgusting version ever, right? That's what the xenomorph is. The Thing takes that to the 100th degree. We're beyond body horror here. There's one thing to do like a disgusting mutated dog. It's another to make it look like that, and it's another to happen 25, 30 minutes in the movie? Maybe I'm even sooner. I'm not going to make some broad stroke argument of no movie has ever gone. It's just, you have to see it to believe it. I mean, it really is, as Rob Bottin did it is on another planet, literally from another planet. I think the defibrillator scene where to resuscitate the one guy and he puts it down and his chest opens up and the mouth is probably, first of all, I think it's this movie's, if you want to put it side by side with Alien, it's its answer to the chest burster. But is one of the greatest, it's a great scare because we're all focused of all the men squabbling amongst themselves that becomes something, it's disgusting. It's something you think about of another man's body being able to open that and bite is, there's one thing to do gross out creature effects, and this movie does that, don't get me wrong. They are just intended to gross you out. It's another to introduce ideas that like repulse you. And I think that like just time and time again, all the creature stuff in this movie is, I mean, there's a great, I forget one of the characters later on says what the audience is thinking. Well, after the defibrillator bites the doctor's hands off and the head falls and sprouts spider legs and walks into the shadows. And one of the characters, I think it's a hippie, just goes, you got to be fucking kidding me. Like that is what the audience's reaction to all these things. I think a lot of horror today, it's not necessarily, I'm not going to use the word safe, but it's like we're not used to seeing, we don't go to a movie and see 5 or 6 sequences that make us go, oh, holy shit, and not see it coming like that, nor does it look like that.
Yeah.
And that's
why you feel that the creative team behind it was really thinking, what kind of weird stuff can we do with this scene? Like, how freaky can we get? How much can we push ourselves to create something new and unseen? Like, you really feel that sort of creative energy that's happening behind the camera in scenes like that. And then when the character says, "What the fuck is going on here?"
But and again, this is when we talk about movies. It is such a collect, because that's it's shot great narratively. That's a great look to our thesis of the fear of the unknown. Well, the indications or the moments where I'm going to show you the monster, I'm going to give you something so unbelievably disgusting and unfathomable that your idea of what this thing is, you still can't even wrap your head around it. That's great writing.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay. First of all, the guys that do creature effects, they're artists in and of themselves, and especially in the 80s, some of they're geniuses. To be able to, first of all, create that practically, make it look how it looks, and then to make it's really the star of the show surrounded by all this other cast. And that's everything working so well in tandem. The dog thing gets me every time, because it's like, you thought dogs were cute. We told you there's something wrong with this dog. You just thought it might have been soft. Like, no, it is so unbelievably unimaginable. Again, this movie, you're right. Anyone ever talks about the thing, they talk about the creature effects because they should talk about the creature effects. Just like people talk about American Werewolf in London for the transformation. These, in that art craft, the thing is one of the pinnacles of something that really, really, really made the practical effects the star of the show. And it is really just, hats off to everyone involved, because they really made something. I'm not going to use the word beautiful, but you know what I mean. It's beautiful.
They made great art. Two things that I read. I don't know if you can confirm either of these, but I think I read that, is it Robbie Critman who did the practical effects? I read that he was like 25 when he did this, which is absolutely insane. And they just had a team of designers, and they were all sort of, the direction was, this thing, we don't know what it actually looks like, so you guys can get as creative and as bold with whatever sorts of designs and sketches you want to do. So I'm just imagining a room of people, sketching things, like sketching the most grotesque things that they could imagine and passing them around, and everyone, laughing and joking around about which ones are great and which ones aren't. And, when you think about things like that happening, that for me, that's one of the great reminders of like why I love movies. Like, oh yes, there was a group of people who was sitting around and decided to make these things that we then get to watch on screen. The other great piece of trivia that I read about that scene is there's like a 2-second shot after the doctor's arms get eaten off by the other guy's belly. And what they did was they cast a double amputee and put a mask over his face to get that 2-second shot of the, of the armed scientist.
Oh, that's awesome. No, I had no idea about that. But that, to go back to your previous point, I mean, that's kind of the beautiful thing of all, we watch movies, and sometimes, we also try to prescribe them to singular voices, like so-and-so is responsible for this. But really, it is an amalgamation of the works of a bunch of different artists with a bunch of different specialties. And when all those things can work in tandem and to create something like this, that, look, this movie came out 40 years ago and we're still talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Let alone when it came out, it didn't get the response it deserved. It's like, these are, you're right. It is the reminder that movies can be great. And there really are very creative people that can do some spectacular things.
We have so many people to thank for the movies that we love. So I think another one of the big sort of selling points of this movie is the ending and how open-ended it is and open to interpretation it is, which, for movies can either be a huge selling point or totally make the whole thing fall flat on its face. I think with this movie, it is a really interesting sort of ending, not just for the open-endedness of it, but just sort of what it means for the overall thesis of the rest of the movie. So all that being said, if you're still here with us, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen The Thing, if you haven't seen it and you're still listening and you do want to see it, and, there were some spoilers ahead of this, but this is the big spoiler. We're going to get into the ending. So, Connor, what do you make of the ending? What is your reading of it? How do you think it fits into the overall thesis of John Carpenter's The Thing?
Well, two things. I'm glad we had the masculinity conversation because I think it's directly related. One, it's the perfect ending for a story like this. You have to have it open-ended because then that's part of my French. That's the fucking point of the whole movie. Like, it really means to be that. But the fact that those two men who've been at odds the whole movie can sit there, not trust each other at all, and share a drink is... First of all, we also started with a drink with McGreedy. So there's an interesting analytical argument to be made. But it's the perfect, you might be a monster, I might be a monster, we'll never trust each other. We're gonna die out here. It is a very existential ending. But the least we can do is have a drink and die, accept fate. And it's just a very, if it didn't end like that, I think it would betray the point of a story. You can't do a horror movie about paranoia and confirm. It just defeats the purpose. Confirming all the paranoias and erasing all the paranoia at the very end of the movie. It just feels like the right. Yeah, I'm gonna gush. It's how the movie should end, and I'm glad it ends that way. Period.
It also, to that point, this movie about paranoia, it has to end with that paranoia. A movie about isolation like this, it can't end with them being rescued in like a helicopter. And, maybe even still in that helicopter scene, there could be some paranoia and some unease and some distrust between the two of them. But then you're missing the isolation element. So it's like, they're still isolated. They're still paranoid. They're going to die. That's kind of, how it had to happen. It doesn't matter if one of them is the thing. It doesn't matter if they're both the thing. It doesn't matter if neither of them is the thing. This is just what needs to happen. It's the only way that it can end.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly, yes.
I did read a theory that I would have to rewatch the movie, but I also don't know if I totally buy that Childs is the thing because his breath doesn't produce the, visible, I don't know what the scientific, verbiage for that is, but his breath isn't visible when he's breathing and it's like freezing there. So it would have to be, and that is an indication that he's the thing, but there's never like a rule that's set up for that earlier in the movie. It also feels like it might just be an oversight, like on set where it didn't happen. So I don't know if you've heard that or if you really like care about whether or not either of them are the thing, or if that like doesn't mean anything to you for the ending.
Yeah, it doesn't mean much to me because we can make analytical arguments about the anatomical of what the thing cannot do, can't breathe, invisible breath is like, even if he is the thing, the point is to not know definitively, and the fact that we don't know definitively puts us in the shoes of those two men, of those two characters, of all the characters throughout the course of the movie. And if a movie about those things can do that, then the narrative is successful, period. It really just, hats off to everyone. it just is, yeah. They also play it so well. It's There's a lot of, look, Keith David and Kurt Russell are excellent in the movie, but that scene between the two of them is the cherry on top to everything. Yeah.
Perfect. I love how you mentioned that it's these two men who are at odds for the entire course of the movie are now finally just, they're the last ones left. They can't trust the other, so they may as well just be civil. And there's a great lesson for all of us in that. We exist in this world with people who we don't trust, who we disagree with, who we're at odds with. But, at the end of the day, let's just be a little civil to each other. Let's share a glass of scotch and, wait to freeze to death in the Antarctica.
It's actually a great point because I feel like horror a lot of times, there are a lot of good things that the horror genre can do. One of the best things it can do is through a horror scenario makes men, makes human beings put their petty human, like in the grand scheme of things, little conflicts mean nothing in the face of bigger actual horror.
Mhm.
And so there's an inherent beauty of horror. And maybe I'll get shot in the face for saying this, but through the most horrific things, it allows human beings to leave that theater with the base knowledge of none of this extraneous baggage, conflict, yelling at each other, petty problems actually matters. It's an interesting genre that can remind us of just the importance of civility, humanity. It's a very strange thing to take a human audience, show them the face of the devil, and then remind them that is way scarier than so and so who cut you off driving on the freeway. Like, it's just a very interesting thing that horror can do. Human beings, like, man.
Now that we're talking about it out loud, I kind of want to say that it's a hopeful ending.
I think it is too. Nihilism aside, that they're going to die, it isn't an entirely unhappy ending, because what Carpenter would have done is put men through the blender, right? Literally through the blender. They get blended up. And the two men that have been kind of squabbling, or whatever, peacocking the whole movie, because that's actually what they've been doing.
Yeah.
The fact that all this hell they face, they can say, you know what, man? Okay, we'll be here. And that's kind of a beautiful thing.
It's also kind of a happy ending because they kind of save the day, even though they don't save themselves. They are in theory stopping the thing from getting out to the world at large. So they completed that mission, even if they, are both going to die. So there's a lot of weird ways that we're making this a happy ending, but I think that reading can certainly be there. And again, that conversation is way more interesting than which one of them might actually be the thing. That doesn't actually, or maybe it does help some people, feel better about the way that the movie ends.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, again, I'm glad you brought up the masculinity earlier, because I think that's kind of, if you read the movie through that lens, that ending actually becomes quite satisfying.
For sure. They're able to put it aside for the greater good.
Yeah.
So that's The Thing. I think we covered pretty much all of it. Before we get into recommendations and all that good stuff, something that we've been doing a little bit during the month of Halloween, while talking about all these different horror movies, these celebrating the spook season. One thing that's particularly sort of unique to this genre is the idea of remakes. Remakes are way more prevalent in this genre than they are in other genres. So The Thing itself is a remake of a movie from 1951, I believe. There is also what I thought was a remake for the longest time, but it is maybe not. There's a 2011 version. I know that you have some thoughts on it. So before we get into recommendations, I just want to quickly get your thoughts on, what you think of that 2011 version. And if you have seen the original 51 version, any thoughts that you have on that as well.
So I haven't seen the original 51, which is there's an interesting commentary there on sometimes people's knowledge or understanding of a certain story comes from a remake rather than the actual original, which, happens with things like Halloween sometimes too for people. And then just before we get to the 2011, just because it is out there, there's a sci-fi channel with a writer named David Leslie Johnson writing, and Frank Darabont was involved. They were going to do a sequel mini series. The scripts are out there.
Interesting.
They're worth checking out because I think, first of all, David Leslie Johnson became a very great writer, and he was I think he was younger when he wrote it, but those scripts are excellent of the miniseries. He went on to write Orphan, which I think is weirdly a perfect movie. But that's a different conversation. The Conjurings and Aquaman, but that predated what was in 2011, which is a prequel.
Mm-hmm.
Which, in a world that was also, just to contextualize where we are in the horror space at that time, that's coming out post a lot of these horror remakes that we saw, a lot of mean-spirited slashers. Some of them were to be honest, very great horror movies. So this is in the wake of that. They did a prequel in 2011 that essentially, what's cool about it is, and that's why I said it's kind of like an autopsy or even of the original movie, is it's about what happened in the Norwegian camp prior to the dog running.
Interesting.
So if you think of this as a narrative canvas, they took all the elements of what was found at that Norwegian camp, the remains of it, what was the remains of the dig site and the missing block in the eye, and they found a way to make all those events true and canon and tell a very compelling thing story about pulling the thing out from the ice and the aftermath of that. And in terms of the plotting that happens, a writer named Eric Heiser wrote it, who is probably one of the best horror writers there is. He was nominated for Oscar, I think, for Arrival, but is a really just strong, like you read him, it's just excellent. I think there's a really strong case to be made that the prequel, regardless of the fact that it's CGI, not practical, which is a kind of a bummer, but is just a very interesting, it's cool. It's a cool narrative to watch. It is cool to see how, if you watch the first one and then go back and watch the prequel right after, you'll see the level of detailing that they mined for it. And I think that's worth, you ask the question of, it is a genre that gets remade a lot. This is a remake that feels like a love letter. That is, someone cared so much about those little details that they found a way to make them make narrative sense in a prequel standalone movie. I just think is worth not only talking about, but also just like, I think it's a movie worth watching. I really applaud that element of it. And I think it's, again, the practical stuff bums me out. The CGI's, I don't think it's as shitty as maybe some critics did, but just as a narrative, I think there's merit in that story, for sure.
That's interesting. Was it always known to be a prequel? Am I a dumbass in thinking that it was a remake, or was it sort of like billed and sold as a remake, and then people walked into the theaters and realized, oh, this is actually a prequel?
It's a good question, because I don't think the trailer maybe necessarily, it doesn't do one of those, remember the thing, like, this is what happened at the Norwegian camp, and the horror fans are like, we totally know what that is, and then everyone else is like, what? Like, I feel like the marketing maybe doesn't sell that image, but it also makes sense to not sell that image. For someone watching the thing for the first time, and they're say they're watching the 2011 prequel, remake, what have you, it works as a movie that is simultaneously a prequel for the fans, but for someone who's never been familiar with that concept before, it feels like it's a cool creature feature. Like, you could assess, because the titling is The Thing again, so you would assume just remake. It's not like Thing Day Zero or something like that. Or,
Norwegian Thing.
Yeah, The Thing, and it just says The Thing, the Thing in Norwegian.
Or the title is just however you say thing in Norwegian.
Yeah. But again, as a big fan of this movie, when I watched that prequel for the first time, regardless of look, I said it like 4 times, not being that practical is a big bummer. That being said, as maybe I just like, the narrative there is, I admire what they did. At the end of the day, I admire that someone took that care and was like, I'm going to do a prequel, and all those details that I really care about, I'm going to make sure they work perfectly. So if you were to watch The Thing and go, hey, the burned body that looked like that was in that right place of snow, they create a horror sequence to make that happen. And I was just like, that's a very cool thing. Good for you. Good work.
Nice. Okay. I might check it out. I've definitely heard mixed reviews. I know, a lot of people really didn't like it, but I think I've heard other, maybe not praise, but other people who support that movie. And if you're a fan of The Thing, you might find some cool things within The Thing. It's a tough movie to talk about, because you refer to everything. We refer to everything as things, but I guess that's the beauty of it. That's also talking about the prequel version of the movie. That's a good sort of stepping stone into our final segment. We're going to do some recommendations for The Thing. That version of The Thing that you gave, Connors, is sort of a light recommendation. So now we'll get into our actual recommendations for any new listeners that we might have out there. For each movie that we introduce into the canon, we also like to recommend 3 things that you should check out if you enjoy said movie. So one of those recommendations has to be another movie. We advise that that movie is not something that is already in the canon. The other 2 things can be anything else in the world. It can be more movies. It could be a TV show. It could be books. It could be documentaries. It could be comic books. It could be I did a restaurant once. So we like to get really weird with it. We like to make the connections as loose as possible. Connor, if you're ready for recommendations, I'm ready for recommendations, and we can jump into this thing. We'll bounce them off one by one. So you'll give your first, then I'll give my first, so on and so forth. My friend, are you ready?
Yes, sir. Let's do it.
Kick us off.
So the first one I'll recommend is a TV miniseries, weirdly enough. It's called The Head. It was a HBO Max, like, international production. It's the Pastor brothers. It is the Agatha Christie version of The Thing. They actually watched The Thing in the pilot, which is about the most obvious love letter to this as you can get. But that's where I think The Thing becomes pretty satisfying. It's a murder mystery down there in the Arctic. It's pretty gnarly. I don't want to spoil too much, but let's just say someone loses a head and that triggers an investigation about who might be responsible. I think it's 6 episodes. It really takes advantage of the elements, the isolated location. There's a great snowed-in, submerged research facility. The set design is awesome. It has some tricks up its sleeve that I think are satisfying. It plays into the same paranoia, just in a peripheral subgenre, which is cool to see an arena that was once one of the greatest creature features ever made, done for like a true detective, brooding sort of murder mystery. It's really international too, which is actually a very cool element of, well, if you're down there, that's all that's down there is all these different countries' research facilities. So it plays into that. Yeah, it's a good little, I think it's like 6 hours. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's a little less. It's a good watch.
That sounds like fun. That sounds super rad. Might add that to the watch list. Sweet. I'm going to go with, all my recommendations are going to be movies with various connection points to The Thing. The first one, which I sort of didn't want to be a recommendation, but I just have to do it because it's one of my favorite movies ever. It pains me so much that it's not in the canon, but the guy who plays Windows, who is the radio operator, he also has a bit part in The Warriors. And Connor, I'm pretty sure you're also, yes.
The Warriors is awesome.
Such a good movie. I rewatched a couple of months ago. Arrow recently announced a new 4K like steelbook box set of it that I ordered immediately. So The Warriors is one of my favorite movies ever. Windows is also, I think he plays Fox in The Warriors. And the first time I watched The Thing, I was like, that guy is in The Warriors. This movie is already cool. So as much as I didn't really want to recommend it for this movie, I have to. So that's my first pick.
Cool. Well, then I'll follow suit and do a movie as well. I'm going to recommend, it was a couple years ago. Hold on, I should get the year. It was like 1 or 2 years ago. Hold on. 2020. It's a Russian horror movie called Sputnik. Have you ever seen it?
I've heard of this. I haven't seen it, but I have heard of it. You may have been the one who...
I might have been the one who said, oh, you should go watch Sputnik. It is not spoiling much. It is a creature feature that deals also with an extraterrestrial. Maybe that's too much of a spoiler. It's a It's a creature. All right. The cat's out of the bag. The monster's out of the box. It's a creature feature that takes place in the aftermath of a Russian Sputnik crash. And there's a survivor. And there's something weird going on. So they bring in an expert to investigate. And it strangely reminds me of a marriage between three movies that are going to sound strange to put side by side, but I'll explain why I put the last one there. It's a marriage between The Thing, it's a marriage between Alien, and it's a marriage between The Exorcist. And the only reason I put The Exorcist in that equation is sometimes we forget that one of the best parts, The Exorcist is obviously in the pantheon of greatest horror movies ever. Mm-hmm. We forget how scientific it is prior to the exorcism that, again, structurally people forget doesn't really happen in the last 20 minutes of the movie. It's a really scientific approach to figure out what's wrong with her. So it reminds me a lot of that, figuring out what's wrong with this astronaut. And it's dealing, so that's happening in the middle of KGB secrecy. And it's just it's a contained movie. It has good payoffs. If you like these sort of classic monster movies with an alien sort of element, and you like that creature sort of stuff, I find it a very satisfying movie. It was one of those splashy movies that, was good enough that enough people started, I think XYZ might have put it out or something like that, but enough people started to talk about it, and it got the platform it deserves. I really think it's a strong horror movie.
That sounds... Okay, that sounds awesome. I'm going to have to check that one out too. These are great picks. I feel like you're more well-versed in the horror genre at large than I am, obviously. But I think otherwise we have a lot of similar tastes and sensibilities in movies. So I was worried that some of the picks that I had would maybe be things that you would have on your list. But it seems like you're going a little bit deeper with your recommendations than I am, so I feel like I'm safe.
Yeah, I accept your recommendation of The Warriors. Everyone should always watch that. It's a great masterpiece.
Yeah, we always have to recommend The Warriors. So the next recommendation that I'm going to do is also kind of a conventional pick. I don't think I'm going as deep as you are with your recommendations, but one thing that we didn't really talk about with The Thing is that this is one of the few cold spooky movies. There aren't a whole lot of cold, snowy, spooky movies. Snow is usually reserved for happy Christmas movies, but there are a few great ones, and I'm going to recommend one of them. I'm going to recommend, I believe it's 2011 Swedish film, Let the Right One In. The vampire movie about, it's like a teenage girl vampire living somewhere in Northern Europe. And that movie kicks ass. I haven't seen it in years, but I remember that it distinctly kicks ass and there's a lot of snow. So that's my second pick.
Yeah, it does kick ass. There are a lot of, first of all, why they haven't done a Friday the 13th sequel in the snow with a hockey mask villain is beyond me, but maybe someday.
Yeah.
What was it? So, can we do some extraneous in the wake of these? I think because the third thing I'll recommend, just for the sake of the conversation and because we're talking about The Thing, and maybe it comes from a background, but I do also recommend people, if you really respond to The Thing and you do like reading scripts, you should look up that David Leslie Johnson's Thing. I think they call it The Thing Returns. It's there's 2 miniseries scripts. They're out there on the internet. Maybe it's not great to recommend scripts that have leaked on the internet, but they are out there. And I think he continues the story in a really terrific manner that, not to spoil things, but uses that ending we talked about as a jumping off point in a particularly satisfying way for what would have been probably one of those epic TV. It was right when Sci-Fi was doing those awesome, maybe I grew up on them, these monster movies of the week that had real low budget. That this would have been like the definitive mini-series version of that. It's awesome. It deals with small towns. It has all the great classic horror textures. I think he knocked the script out of the park, but it's just like not in a teasy way of like what could have been.
Mm-hmm.
It's just if you like this story and you like the setup, it's a very fun read to see where it could have gone in a. And believe me, he brings the creature feature element very, very hard
I
and
love
very,
it.
very strong. I really am. It's one of those things I'm bummed we didn't get to see in the flesh. Yeah.
Yeah, that sucks that it never got made. That's a great recommendation, and everyone can do a quick Google search, and if you find it, you find it. Give it a read. That's a
Yeah.
great third pick. I love it. So yeah, I always have a list of like usually around 5 movies that I want to recommend, and when I get to the third choice, it's always such a hard pick of like which one is going to make the cut and which ones will be recycled for a later episode. But I think I know which one I'm going to go with for my third pick. I don't know if this is a movie that we've talked about. I feel like it's one that you would enjoy, even if it's not something that you totally support the way that you love the thing. I feel like it's a movie that you would dig, but sort of going with that paranoia vibe of more with that Agatha Christie sort of whodunit kind of story, but a movie that came out pretty recently that I feel like does that in a really, really, really fun way. And that's really the only connection point that it has to the thing. But I know a lot of people didn't really like it, but I think Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is like a pretty cool, fun movie.
I saw it. Yeah. There's the. I think the ending is really satisfying.
I think
really
the ending is super satisfying
Yeah.
for many different reasons.
Well, just it's hilarious. I don't want to spoil it, but the ending of the movie is the reason it deserves to exist. I think there's first of all, it's a great platform for all these super talented young actresses. But yes, okay, sorry, I'm cutting in. The ending makes it worth watching. I recommend too. Yes.
No, I mean, look, it's definitely it has its low points, but like you said, it's a great showcase for a lot of really cool young actresses, and the ending is pretty satisfying, and it will satisfy different people for different reasons. We'll just leave it at that. Before we say our final goodbyes, let's just run through the recommendations 1, 2, 3, boom, 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 really quick for anyone who may have missed it the first time around.
Okay, so recommendation number 1 was The Head on HBO Max, a miniseries. Recommendation number 2 was a movie called Sputnik, a Russian horror movie from 2020 that is great creature stuff. And recommendation 3 is searching on the internet for David Leslie Johnson's The Thing Returns scripts. They're very, very strong and would have been an awesome thing to watch.
Sweet. I've got The Warriors, and I failed to mention the actor's name, but Thomas G. Waits is the guy who plays Windows and Fox. He's our connection point for that recommendation. So The Warriors is number 1. Let the Right One In is number 2, and Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is number 3. Connor McKnight, thank you so much for joining. This was a super fun episode. Thank you for all of your insight. I hope you had half as much fun as I had talking about The Thing. I know it's one of your favorite movies, so it's always fun to have someone on the show who is a genuine fan of whatever movie we're talking about. And I feel like that came through.
No, thank you for having me. This is a riot. Anything that gives The Thing the platform it deserves, worth it. So it was wonderful.
Anything that folks can be on the lookout for from you, anything that you want to plug, or is everything under wraps at the moment?
I would say everything's under wraps, but yeah. we'll see. Post strike, we'll see how the things shape up.
But yeah, Screen Agent once again, Connor McKnight. Everything is under wraps for now that he's working on, but you will see his name on a ton of great projects all around. Be on the lookout. Thank you again for joining the Canon. Listeners, thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week with The Shining. And until then, stay safe, stay spooky, and we will see you at the cinemas.